Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be taking a look at something honestly kind of shocking. We're talking about the Chinese workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad back in the 1800s. It's one of those stories where the idea of the American dream, the gold rush and all that, takes a pretty dark turn.
Yeah, it's a part of history that often gets left out. It really shows how complicated immigration, labor, and even that whole American dream idea really were for different people back then.
So imagine this. It's the mid-1800s, gold is found in California, and suddenly everyone wants a piece of it. Tons of people, especially from China, are crossing oceans, risking it all for a chance at a better life. But here's the thing. For a lot of those Chinese immigrants, the gold rush wasn't about finding gold themselves.
It wasn't about striking it rich, panning for nuggets. They ended up building the country instead.
Exactly. They wanted building the Transcontinental Railroad, that massive project to connect the East Coast all the way to the West.
And let me tell you, the Central Pacific Railroad, the company in charge of building the railroad eastward from California, they were struggling. Finding people to do the work was hard enough, and the conditions were brutal. A lot of their workers, mainly Irish immigrants, were demanding more money because it was so dangerous.
So they needed a solution, and fast, right?
Exactly. And that's where the Chinese workers came in. The railroad company, well, they saw a chance. They could hire these workers for less pay than they were giving to white workers. It was a messed up situation, really. This prejudice that Chinese workers would be easier to control, less likely to complain, that kind of thinking.
Basically, they were seen as disposable, which is just awful.
Yeah, it's a terrible part of the story for sure. But here's the thing. Even with the low pay and the terrible conditions, these Chinese workers were the backbone of the railroad's construction.
Oh, totally. I was reading about this. They were blasting tunnels through mountains, hanging off cliffs to set dynamite, dealing with crazy weather, all of it. It's unbelievable.
Exactly. Most people wouldn't even try to do that kind of work. Too dangerous, too much. But the Chinese workers, they did it.
And they weren't just getting by, they were amazing at it. Need some help? Don't know why. Boost your biz. It's a breeze. Positify.ai, the future's bright. Outsource now. Reach the sky. People were saying how hardworking, dedicated, and efficient they were.
They were the key. Think about it. You're a Chinese worker. You risked everything to come to America. You deal with backbreaking labor, prejudice all the time, but you're helping to build one of the most incredible things ever built.
And then to be told, thanks, but you're not really wanted here.
That's the reality they faced. Just as the railroad was almost done, anti-Chinese feelings started getting really bad. These same workers who were so important to the project, suddenly they were blamed for economic problems called threats to American jobs and wages. It was a whole thing.
Wow. So it wasn't just casual racism. It was like a full-on campaign against them, like in the newspapers and everything.
Exactly. We're talking newspapers printing racist stereotypes, politicians using fear tactics in their speeches, everything to turn people against the Chinese. It's a shameful part of American history, really. All that fear and anger, it ended up becoming law, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Ugh, just hearing that name gives me chills.
It shows you how easily prejudice can become official, And this law, it didn't just limit immigration, it basically slammed the door shut on Chinese workers trying to come to the U.S.
So what about the Chinese immigrants who are already here? The ones who had built lives, families, communities?
They were stuck. This act, it said they couldn't become citizens. Imagine you help build a country, you're part of its growth, and then you're told you can never really belong.
It totally goes against that whole idea of America being a melting pot.
It shows the hypocrisy, right? And this part of the story, it's often forgotten, brushed aside when we talk about American history.
It's like their work was celebrated when it was convenient, and then they were pushed aside when they weren't needed anymore.
That's a good way to put it. And the damage from this Chinese Exclusion Act, it was huge. Families are ripped apart. People who dreamed of bringing their loved ones over, or even just going back home someday, they were trapped.
And those who stayed here were pushed to the edges of society, right?
Yeah. A lot of them ended up confined to Chinatowns. Now, these Chinatowns, they were places of community, ways to keep their culture and language alive. But they were also places with a lot of poverty, where opportunities were limited and discrimination was everywhere.
So basically, this law created a system where segregation and exclusion were just part of life.
Right. It reinforced this idea that Chinese immigrants, no matter how hard they worked or what they contributed, they were always outsiders, never truly American. It's tragic and infuriating at the same time. But there's another side to this story. even with this blatant discrimination, the Chinese community, they didn't just disappear.
So what did they do? How did they respond to all of this?
They were incredibly resilient. They started businesses, built schools, created support systems to help each other succeed in a society that was actively working against them. Think about the strength it takes to face that kind of adversity, not just survive, but actually build a life for yourself, for your community.
It's amazing, really. It shows you the power of the human spirit.
It really does. But remember, this wasn't just about quiet resilience. They never stopped fighting for their rights, for equality, for their rightful place in America. They challenged the Exclusion Act in the courts, organized protests, made their voices heard.
They took action, refused to be victims.
Exactly. And those efforts, even though they were met with more resistance, more discrimination, they planted the seeds for change that would eventually come. It took decades, but their fight led to a turning point in 1943.
The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Exactly. Finally, in 1943, after 61 years, this wrong was made right.
It just shows you, right, the power of never giving up hope.
Absolutely. But it's also a stark reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied. Those 6 decades of exclusion left a huge scar on generations of Chinese Americans. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs, they deserve to be heard and understood.
It makes you think about all the other stories out there, other communities who have faced these same struggles throughout history and even today.
And that's the power of digging into a story like this. It shines a light on this fight for equality, for belonging, for a just world, a fight that's still going on today.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? This one community's experience, it's like a window into something so much bigger.
That's history for you. It's not just about names and dates, it's about understanding those forces that shape our world,
Yeah.
the struggles that connect us through time.
And when you think about something like the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's not just some random event from the past, right? Makes you ask those tough questions. Who gets to be considered American? Who gets the opportunities? Whose stories are even told?
Big questions, and honestly, we're still trying to figure those out today. The fight for a fair society where everyone has a chance, no matter where they come from, that's a journey we're still on.
That's true. This whole experience, it makes you think about all those people throughout history, the ones who built this country, literally, with their own hands. They went through so much, and we don't even realize it.
We owe it to them to remember, to honor those sacrifices and learn from what happened. It's about acknowledging those injustices, not to dwell on the past, but to help us build a better future.
I know for me, learning about the Chinese railroad workers, it changes how I see things. Every bridge I cross, every highway reminds me of what it took to connect this entire country.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't free, and we've got to understand that, acknowledge it, and try to build a future where everyone benefits.
So as we wrap up, here's what I'm left thinking about. Knowing what we now know about these workers, their contributions, their sacrifices, how should we remember them? How do we honor what they did?
That's a question worth thinking about. How do we make sure their story doesn't just fade away, but becomes something we learn from, something that inspires us to be better?
For sure.
Yeah.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into this really incredible and often forgotten part of American history. We'll see you next time as we uncover more stories that shape our world. Need some help? Don't know why? Boost your biz. It's a breeze. Positify.ai. The future's bright. Outsource now. Reach the sky.